The general's voice cut through the chaos like steel. He said, "Stand down." His order echoed across the canyon floor, sharp and final. Every rifle lowered, every finger froze on the trigger. But in that breathless silence, one soldier saw what he didn't. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she locked eyes on the glint of a sniper scope hidden high in the rocks. If she obeyed, they would all die. If she disobeyed, she would lose everything. You're watching The Storyscape, where hidden legends come alive. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where are you watching from. And as you listen, ask yourself, what would you have done in her place? The valley stretched wide and unforgiving, its jagged walls cutting the morning sun into long, fractured shadows. Heat already pressed down like a heavy hand, though it was barely passed on. Every step of the patrol echoed against the stone, boots grinding gravel, straps creaking, rifles clinking against gear. To the men, it was just another march across another stretch of desert, routine, tedious, and strangely quiet. At the center of the column walked General Mason. His chest carried medals that told stories of battles fought decades earlier, and his presence alone carried the weight of command. He was the kind of officer whose voice carried certainty, a man who embodied control even when chaos threatened. Behind him, the soldiers moved with the rhythm of obedience. They trusted him, they always had. And somewhere in that formation, helmet tilted low, boots coated with dust, rifle clinking against gear, was Sergeant Claire Donovan. To most eyes, she was a shadow. Another uniform, another rifle. She didn't bark orders, she didn't draw attention. She was the type of soldier people forgot about until she was standing right next to them. But her eyes missed nothing. Claire had learned long ago that silence could speak louder than any command. And in the silence of that morning, she felt something was wrong. The valley was too still. The wind carried no song of birds, no trace of movement except their own. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. They crossed the dry riverbed one by one, the crunch of boots on stone echoing unnaturally loud. Then, like the crack of a whip, the world shattered. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that snapped against the cliffs. A soldier at the point dropped without a word, his body collapsing into the dust. Shouts followed, overlapping, panicked. Rifles swung up, fingers curled on triggers. The canyon erupted with fire. Bullets ricocheted off rock, throwing splinters of stone into the air. Men scrambled, dropping behind cover, pressing themselves flat against the earth.
Claire's body reacted before her mind caught up. She was already rolling behind a jagged outcrop, rifle raised, eyes sweeping the cliffs. Dust burned her throat as she drew steady breaths, forcing her racing pulse into silence. Years of training she never spoke about guided her vision. Patterns, angles, movement. Somewhere up there, beyond the confusion, was the hand that had lit the fire. Then his voice cut through the storm. "Stand down!" General Mason didn't shout often, but when he did, men listened. His command silenced the panic in an instant. Fingers froze on triggers. The noise of gunfire slowed, stuttering, until half the rifles lowered. The canyon echoed with confusion, hesitation. Claire's head whipped toward him. Mason stood tall, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command. To him, this was suppressive fire, a tactic meant to rattle, not kill. If they held position, if they resisted the urge to shoot back, he believed the ambush would lose momentum. But Claire had seen it. Just for a second, in the chaos, sunlight catching on glass, a reflection no ordinary rock would throw. A sniper. High on the ridgeline, perfectly hidden, waiting for the pause that Mason had just ordered, waiting for stillness, waiting for obedience. Her chest tightened. Every soldier around her obeyed, rifles slack in their hands.
Even the ones who still clutched their weapons glanced toward the general, torn between instinct and order. Claire's scope swept the ridgeline. There, a sliver of steel tucked between two jagged boulders, the faint curve of a barrel, invisible to anyone not looking for it. She adjusted her grip, breath steadying. The sniper's scope was already moving, sliding down from the shadows, locking onto the largest target in sight, Mason himself. Claire's throat could dry. She could see it unfolding, as if time had slowed. The glint of the scope, the angle of the barrel, the slight shift as the sniper's finger hovered over his trigger. Her own finger tightened against the metal of her rifle. The rules of command screamed in her head. Obey, stand down, wait. But instinct roared louder. Act now, before it's too late. Dust swirled around her boots as she exhaled, eyes locked on that sliver of glass. The men around her crouched in silence, obeying. The general stood proud, blind to the danger about to strike him down. And in that moment, Claire Donovan understood. No one else had seen it. No one else would move. The choice and the cost was hers alone. Claire's finger rested on the trigger, but the weight of the order pressed down harder than the steel itself. Stand down. The words hadn't just come from a superior officer. They had come from a man who embodied authority, who had commanded battlefields long before many of these soldiers were even born. To defy him was to defy the chain of command itself, the spine that held the military together. Her breath fogged the edge of her scope as she tracked a sliver of movement on the ridge. The sniper hadn't fired again. He didn't need to. He had patience on his side. Every second of hesitation, every rifle lowered in obedience was a gift. He was calm. She could almost feel it through the sights. His stillness, his confidence, the steady squeeze he was preparing on his trigger. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears. Around her, soldiers looked at one another, eyes wide, knuckles white. One private mouthed a silent protest, torn between instinct and order. Another pressed his helmet tighter against his head, muttering prayers into the dust. Mason stood tall, his frame like a monument, his voice echoing again. Stand down! The words reverberated through the canyon walls, ironclad, final. But Claire knew. She knew in a way she couldn't explain, the same way she'd known years ago in dark alleys and distant mountains, where silence preceded blood. Her training wasn't the same as theirs. She had walked missions no one spoke of, where hesitation was a death sentence, where instinct was the only compass. And in that instant, her past rose up to meet her. She remembered another ridge, another scope glinting in the sun, the face of a friend she'd failed to warn in time, the echo of a single shot that had left her standing in silence while the world collapsed around her. That memory never left, and now, staring through her scope, she felt the weight of it pressing her finger forward. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to shout, to warn Mason, to call the threat, but the order hung in the air like a noose. She saw the danger clearer than anyone, but words wouldn't cut through command. Only action would. The sniper shifted, just enough to confirm her fear. His scope was locked on Mason's chest, the crosshair steady, unmoving. Claire inhaled once, slowly, deeply. The desert seemed to fall silent, even as stray gunfire cracked across the valley. She didn't hear it, didn't feel the dust whipping against her skin. The world funneled down to a single line, her sight aligned with his. She exhaled and squeezed. The rifle roared, breaking the stillness with thunder. The recoil surged into her shoulder, firm, familiar. A burst of dust erupted from the ridge as her round struck. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the silhouette crumbled, collapsing sideways, his rifle tumbling free from the rocks. Silence followed. Not the silence of obedience, but the stunned silence of disbelief. Every head turned, eyes wide, jaws clenched. Soldiers stared at her, then at Mason, then back at the ridge. The general's face froze. For a moment, fury sparked in his eyes, the kind of fury reserved for insubordination, for betrayal. But then he saw it. The rifle sliding down the rock, glinting as it bounced into the dust. The body sprawled, lifeless, and realization dawned.
The order he had given would have killed them all. Claire kept her rifle steady, eyes locked on the ridge, scanning for more threats. She didn't flinch under the stairs, didn't move under the weight of Mason's silence. Her duty wasn't to ego or to appearances. It was to survival, to her unit, to truth. The canyon remained still. No more shots came. No more enemies revealed themselves. The ambush had depended on that one man, the sniper who had been seconds from ending Mason's life. Around her, whispers stirred. One soldier muttered, She saved us." Another nodded, the truth too heavy to deny. Helmets turned toward her, not in anger, but in awe. Mason's jaw tightened, his hand curled into a fist at his side. He was a man unaccustomed to being proven wrong, especially in front of his men. But he had no words, no rebuke, only the unshakable truth that his life and theirs had been spared by the very defiance he had tried to crush. Claire lowered her rifle slowly, the motion calm, deliberate. Her breath was steady now, though her chest burned with the weight of what she had just done. She had broken the unbreakable rule. She had silenced the chain of command with a single shot. And yet, no one moved to condemn her. No one dared. Because every man there knew they were alive because of her. The dust settled, the valley exhaled, and in the space between obedience and survival, Sergeant Claire Donovan had become something no rank could define. The soldier who had seen what no one else did and acted when no one else dared. For a long moment, no one moved. Dust hung suspended in the sunlight, drifting lazily across the canyon, as if time itself refused to advance. The echo of Claire's shot still lingered in their ears, carved into the silence. Then came the whispers. They rolled like ripples through the unit, small at first, then growing louder. She took the shot, dropped him, clean. She just saved the general. Every helmet turned toward her, faces streaked with dirt, eyes still wide with the raw edge of fear, but all of them fixed on her. Not on Mason, not on the rows of medals across his chest, on her. Claire didn't flinch. She kept her rifle tucked, eyes scanning the ridges. One shot didn't mean safety. One enemy down didn't mean the fight was over. Ambushes rarely came alone. But she could feel the weight of their stares pressing into her back. She could feel Mason's silence like a storm cloud building just behind her shoulder.
The general didn't speak. Not yet. He stood frozen in the center of the unit, boots anchored to the ground, fists clenched at his sides. His jaw ticked as the words were fighting to break free, but found no ground to stand on. For decades, his voice had been law. For decades, his orders had carved the shape of battles. And now, in one breath, in one defiant shot, Claire had shattered the illusion of infallibility that wrapped around him like armor. One private, barely old enough to shave, broke the silence with a muttered, "If she hadn't." He stopped himself, catching Mason's glare. But the words had already escaped into the air, undeniable. If she hadn't acted, the general would be dead. They all might be. Claire adjusted her stance, crouching lower, her rifle following the ridgeline. Her breathing was steady again, her mind focused. She wasn't here for their awe. She wasn't here for his approval. She was here to keep them alive. A sound broke through the quiet, faint, metallic, out of place. Not the wind, not the shifting of stone. Claire's eyes narrowed. It came from the eastern ridge, where jagged shadows cloaked the rocks. A scrape, followed by the clatter of something being dragged. "Contact, East Ridge," she hissed, pointing with her rifle. Half the men jolted, the other half hesitated, torn between instinct and the lingering echo of Mason's last order: stand down. They looked at him, waiting, caught in the no-man's land between obedience and survival. Mason's face hardened. His pride battled with reality in the space of a heartbeat. He wanted to believe the threat was gone, that order still meant control, but his silence was louder than any command. Claire didn't wait. She pressed her cheek into her rifle stock, scanning the rocks. Shapes moved there. 2, maybe 3. Their camouflage blended with the stone, but the glint of metal gave them away. Another sniper team, repositioning now that their cover was blown. She barked over her shoulder, her voice sharp, cutting. "Targets, 200 meters east ridge, engage!" This time, the hesitation lasted only a breath. The soldiers obeyed her, not him. Rifles cracked in unison, fire pouring toward the ridge. The ambush crumbled under the weight of sudden resistance. Shouts echoed from the rocks, followed by silence, then the telltale thud of bodies falling. Claire swept her sights across the ridge one last time. Nothing moved. The dust hung heavy, curling through shafts of light. Slowly, she exhaled. And then the canyon was quiet again. But the quiet was different now. Not the suffocating stillness from before, not the manufactured silence of obedience. This quiet was alive, humming with realization. The men had seen who acted when it mattered. They had seen who froze and who fired. Claire lowered her rifle. Around her, soldiers straightened, their eyes no longer darting to Mason for direction. They looked at her instead. Not with defiance, not even with open challenge, with something heavier, something that would linger long after the dust settled. Respect. Mason finally spoke. His voice was low, sharp as broken glass. "Sergeant Donovan, step forward." Every soldier stiffened. The order cracked like a whip, dragging their attention back to him. Claire rose slowly, boots grinding against the gravel, and stepped from behind cover. She walked into the open, into the center of the unit, under the weight of every stare. Mason's eyes locked onto hers. His face was unreadable, carved from stone. But beneath the surface, anger and something else flickered. A recognition he didn't want to admit. "You disobeyed a direct order." His words carried like steel, measured, precise. Claire stood still, her rifle lowered but firm in her hands. Her voice was calm, steady. "I saved your life, sir." The canyon swallowed the words. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Mason's jaw tightened, his lips parting as though to unleash fury, but he stopped. The truth was too heavy to crush with authority. His silence stretched long enough that the men around him shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, others held his gaze with barely concealed doubt. For the first time in years, General Mason's authority cracked, not from enemy fire, not from a failed strategy, from a single soldier who had refused to obey, and in doing so, had preserved them all. Claire didn't flinch under his stare. She didn't step back. She didn't apologize. Because she knew, and now they all knew, that courage wasn't measured in stripes or stars, but in the moment you risked everything for the ones beside you. The silence deepened, stretching taut, until it was broken by a voice from the ranks, low but steady. "Respect, Sergeant." It was just 2 words, but they carried like a bell echoing in the canyon, unshakable. Others nodded one by one until the air itself seemed to shift. And in that moment, Claire Donovan ceased to be invisible. The words still echoed in the canyon like a drumbeat. "Respect, Sergeant." It had not been shouted, not even spoken loudly, yet it carried more weight than any command Mason had given that morning. The soldiers shifted on their feet, their glances darting between the general and Claire, and in that simple exchange, the balance of the entire unit had shifted. Mason's shoulders stiffened. He had been obeyed his entire life, from cadets barely out of school to officers hardened by decades of war. He was used to fear, discipline, obedience. Not this, not silence that hummed with doubt, not loyalty leaning toward another. Claire held his gaze without blinking. She knew what he wanted: an apology, an excuse, some concession to remind the others that rank still ruled. But she gave him nothing. Her expression was calm, steady, the kind of look carved not by arrogance, but by certainty. Her voice cut the silence, quiet but unshakable. "Sir, orders exist to protect lives. Today, mine did." It wasn't defiance, it was truth. And truth, spoken aloud in front of men who had just tasted it themselves, was more dangerous than any bullet. The general's jaw worked, but no words came. His silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Then Claire turned away from him, not rudely, but with focus, scanning the ridgeline again. She refused to linger in the power struggle. Survival wasn't about egos. It was about vigilance. And it was that vigilance that caught it. A flicker of movement near the mouth of the canyon. Not on the ridges this time. Lower. Closer. She adjusted her stance, narrowing her eyes. Dust rose in faint clouds from behind a cluster of rocks. It wasn't the wind. It was boots. Many boots. Her stomach tightened. "Movement, 12 o'clock, she called out, her tone sharp, professional. The men turned instantly, rifles swinging. They saw it now too, silhouettes forming out of the haze, spreading wide across the canyon floor. Enemy reinforcements. Not snipers this time, but ground troops, rifles raised, advancing with grim purpose. Mason barked, "Defensive positions!" His voice cracked through the unit, but for the first time, hesitation followed. Not because they doubted the command itself, but because of who had given it. Their bodies moved slower than before, their eyes flicking to Claire even as they obeyed. She was already in motion, pointing out cover, shifting 2 soldiers left, another 3 to the rocks on the right. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her gestures were precise, her tone clear, and they followed without question, their boots thundering against the canyon floor as they fell into positions that made sense in the chaos. Claire dropped behind a slab of stone, resting her rifle on the jagged edge. Her breathing slowed as the enemy closed the distance. They were disciplined, moving in formation, covering each other with suppressive fire. Whoever had set this ambush hadn't underestimated them. This was planned, deliberate, meant to crush. Rounds sparked off the rocks, the air hissing with near misses. Shards of stone cut into her sleeve, drawing blood, but she ignored it. Her scope found the lead man, his silhouette crisp against the haze. She exhaled and fired. He fell. Another took his place. She fired again. The canyon erupted in thunder. Her men, no, Mason's men, now fired with fury, their rifles cracking in unison, their voices carrying through the dust, but still their eyes flicked toward her between shots. It was her tempo they matched, her calm that steadied their hands. Mason crouched low behind cover, his pistol clutched but unused. He scanned the chaos, shouting orders that were swallowed by gunfire. For the first time in his career, he felt the words fall flat, sliding uselessly into the dust. They weren't looking to him anymore. He had become background noise, a shadow of authority. And in that realization, something dangerous twisted in him. Not fear, though the sniper's bullet had nearly claimed him, but pride, raw and wounded. He risked a glance toward Claire. She was a silhouette of certainty, her rifle steady, her voice cutting through the storm with calm directives. The men leaned toward her words, not his. And deep inside, Mason realized he could either cling to pride and watch them all fall, or acknowledge the truth staring back at him. Claire's truth. Bullets whipped overhead, one shattering the rock inches from her head. She didn't flinch. Her mind was too focused, her instincts too sharp. And as the enemy pressed harder, memories flickered at the edges of her thoughts, not of today, but of another battlefield long ago. She saw herself kneeling in the ruins of a collapsed building, a rifle in her hands, the night broken by tracers and fire. She had been younger then, nameless, buried in operations that never made reports. She remembered a voice in her ear, calm and firm, whispering, "Trust your eyes. Trust what you know, not what you're told." That voice had guided her through years of missions the world would never hear of. And it whispered again now, echoing in the canyon, aligning with every fiber of her being. The men pressed on, firing in tight volleys. Enemies fell, dust clouds rising with each impact. The canyon floor became a battlefield painted in sweat and smoke. Claire moved like she had been born in it, shifting positions, calling out ranges, her commands simple but razor-sharp. And for the first time, the men no longer hesitated between her voice and Mason's. They chose. They chose her. The firefight raged on, the echoes of rifles slamming against the stone walls, the acrid smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Claire's arms burned from the recoil, her throat raw from shouting positions, but she didn't stop. She couldn't, because she knew something Mason didn't. Ambushes come in layers, and this was only the second. The third was still waiting. The canyon had become a furnace. Gunfire cracked against the stone walls, amplifying into a deafening roar. Dust swirled thick enough to choke, mixing with the acrid bite of cordite. Shouts echoed, orders mingled with cries of pain. Boots scraped against gravel as men scrambled to reload and reposition. The enemy's second wave had been fierce, but Claire's calm had steadied the line. Volley by volley, her soldiers had cut them down. Still, as the echoes of the last shots faded, a silence pressed in, heavy, unnatural, loaded. It wasn't over. She knew it in her bones. "Eyes up," she warned, her voice low but clear. That wasn't the main force. Some of the men glanced at her, brows furrowed, but they didn't argue. They had learned not to. Already their bodies tensed, rifles reloaded, fingers brushing triggers as they scanned the ridges. And then they heard it. A sound that didn't belong to rifles or boots. A deep, mechanical growl rolling through the canyon like thunder. Engines. Claire's stomach dropped. Vehicles, she muttered. Mason rose slightly from his cover, his expression tightening as the first silhouette crested the ridge. Armored, heavy, a mounted gun glinting under the sun, and behind it, another and another. Armored carriers, reinforcements. The men's faces drained of color. They had expected rifles, maybe more snipers. Not this, not steel beasts rolling down the narrow pass, their engines snarling, their mounted weapons swiveling with lethal intent. RPGs, she shouted over the chaos, scanning her men. Where are the launchers? A corporal scrambled, hauling a tube from his pack, hands shaking. Another soldier tossed to the spare rockets, his movements clumsy with adrenaline. Claire dropped beside them, seizing the launcher. Her motions were practiced, fluid, not the fumbling of someone trained once in a classroom. No hesitation, no doubt. She checked the sights, snapped a rocket into place, braced against the stone. The corporal froze. "Ma'am, you've done this before?" Her eyes locked on the approaching armor. "More times than you want to know." The first carrier rumbled closer, its gun already spitting fire, cutting a spray of stone just feet from their cover. Men ducked, one screaming, a shrapnel tore into his leg. "Cover me," she barked. Rifles lit up in unison, pouring fire toward the ridge to distract the gunners. Claire leaned into the launcher, exhaled slowly, and squeezed. The rocket streaked across the canyon, a trail of smoke carving through the dust. It slammed into the carrier's front axle, detonating with a deafening roar. Flame and shrapnel burst outward, the vehicle lurching sideways, collapsing into the rock wall with a screech of tearing steel. The canyon erupted in cheers. For a heartbeat, hope surged, but more engines growled above. Another carrier appeared, larger, its gun sweeping down. The roar of its weapon shook the ground, chewing stone into clouds of debris. Claire grabbed another rocket, her hand steady even as the earth shook. The corporal beside her fumbled to reload, his fingers slipping. She snatched the launcher back, her motions crisp, unshaken.
"Left ridge top angle," she ordered, voice carrying over the chaos. The men obeyed, laying suppressive fire exactly where she pointed. The armored beast hesitated, its gunners ducking as rounds clattered against its armor. Claire sighted, fired. The second rocket slammed into its turret, igniting a fireball that billowed black smoke into the sky. The carrier collapsed, flames licking its hull, the men inside scrambling before being silenced by the explosion. The canyon shook with the blast. The soldiers roared in triumph now, voices echoing off the cliffs. But Claire didn't cheer. She reloaded. Her eyes swept the ridges again. She knew better. Ambushes came in layers, always in layers. Mason crouched nearby, his face pale, his chest heaving. His pistol hung useless at his side. He stared at her, at the smooth precision of her movements, at the authority in her voice, at the way the men followed her without hesitation. It wasn't just instinct. It wasn't luck. She had done this before, many times. And in that moment, Mason realized the truth. Claire Donovan was no ordinary sergeant. She was something else entirely. Someone forged in shadows, in missions unspoken, in battles the world never admitted happened. The third engine growl rolled into the canyon. Louder, closer. Claire's jaw set, her eyes narrowed through the dust, and she whispered to herself, so quietly no one else heard, "Not today." The third carrier crawled into view, its engine howling like a beast, its metal frame scorched black from smoke and dust. The mounted gun swiveled down, a shadow cutting across the canyon floor. Every man in Mason's unit tensed, some clutching rifles with trembling hands, others whispering prayers into the dirt. Claire didn't tremble. Her hands were steady as stone, her breathing slow, deliberate. She studied the terrain, her eyes not on the machine itself, but on the canyon walls around it. She had learned long ago that steel could be destroyed not just by firepower, but by the earth itself. "Suppress the gunners," she ordered, her voice cutting like a blade through the chaos. Her men obeyed instantly, rifles cracked, volleys sparking off the armor. The carrier's weapon choked for a heartbeat as its gunner ducked. That heartbeat was all she needed. "Explosives!" she shouted. A private near her pack fumbled, pulling out 2 charges meant for breaching stone doors. Claire snatched them, her motions crisp, controlled. She scanned the canyon wall above the vehicle, jagged stone already weakened by earlier blasts. One precise detonation would do what no rocket could. "Cover me." Before anyone could protest, she sprinted low across the canyon floor, dust kicking up around her boots. Bullets snapped past her, striking stone, biting into the dirt. She slid behind a rock face, pressed her back to the cliff, and scaled upward with a speed that stunned the soldiers below.
From the ridge, the battlefield spread beneath her, the carrier grinding forward, the men held in cover, Mason crouched like a relic of another age. She set the charges fast, planting them deep into the fractured rock, her hands moving with the certainty of someone who had done this 100 times. She dropped back down, rolled into cover, and gripped the detonator. Her eyes swept the men, their faces drawn and exhausted. And then her gaze locked with Mason's. For a moment, the chaos faded. The truth passed between them in silence. She had acted when he hadn't. She had led when he faltered. She pressed the trigger. The canyon wall erupted in a thunderous roar. Stones shattered free, boulders tumbling like giants. The carrier didn't stand a chance. Tons of rock collapsed onto its hull, crushing it under a storm of stone and fire. The explosion rattled the ground beneath their feet, shaking the very air from their lungs. When the dust cleared, nothing moved. The canyon was silent again, except for the ragged breathing of men who had just witnessed death's hand pulled away at the last second. Claire lowered the detonator, her face streaked with sweat and dust, her expression calm. Around her, soldiers rose slowly from cover, their eyes wide, their voices low, reverent. One by one, they began to stand straighter, not to Mason, to her. The words spread in murmurs, building into something unshakable. Respect. Mason stood rigid in the center, his fists clenched. His pride screamed at him to reassert command, to reestablish the old order. But the truth was undeniable. His men had already chosen, and he knew it. His gaze met Claire's one last time. No words, just silence. A silence that admitted everything his pride would not. Claire nodded once, not as a subordinate seeking approval, but as a soldier acknowledging the weight of what had just been done. Then she turned, scanning the canyon, her rifle steady, already focused on the next threat that might come. Because for her, survival was never about glory. It was about the men beside her. It was about seeing what others could not, and acting when others would not. The unit followed her out of the canyon, boots crunching in unison, their heads held higher than before. And though no medals would mark the day, every man who walked that valley carried the truth etched into his bones. When orders failed, when pride blinded, when silence threatened to end them all, it was Claire Donovan who stood, who fired, who led. And even a general had nothing left to say.